Joining me now is Tanisha Sullivan, president of the Boston branch of the NAACP. Tanisha, thank you for being with us this morning. As you know, a day of peaceful protests turned violent last night in downtown Boston. What is your reaction to the protests in Boston?
Well, I think first we have to remember that protest and demonstration really is the cornerstone, is one of the cornerstones of our democracy. It is what really makes America stand out in comparison to some other countries around the world where protest and demonstration is not allowed. And it is important to remember that that is part of our democracy. And in fact, protest and demonstration is how our country actually was able to, over generations, move forward. So the protest and the demonstration is important. It is appropriate at this time, especially as we see that our nation is in mourning. And as we're seeing across the country, people from all stripes are outraged and really wanting to, in this moment, see change as a result of the brutal murder that was filmed in broad daylight, the brutal murder of George Floyd.
Tanisha, Boston is one of many cities across the country where protests have broken out. So how is the NAACP responding on a national level?
I think it's important to remember how we got here and why we're here. Certainly, we do not condone violence as an organization. I do not condone violence as an individual. That being said, it is important for us to understand where the violence, where the rage is coming from. It is the result of generations of a knee on the neck. We saw the life of George Floyd literally be sucked out of him by a knee on the neck. That knee really is symbolic for so many of us in the Black community and so many of us who have been in this civil rights movement for decades, in that we've been fighting against knees on the neck in our education system, in our public health system, in our criminal justice system, in our economic system for so very long. We see racial disparities everywhere we look. And those racial disparities have been sucking the life out of the Black community for far too long. And so George Floyd's murder really is, in so many ways, emblematic of what is happening across cities in this nation every day. And so as we're seeing certainly peaceful protests, and other types of demonstrations, it's important to remember that justice is what brings us to a point of peace. And so the question for all of us today who are outraged, who want to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing, the question is, how do we get to justice in this moment? And justice is more than the charging and convicting of the Minneapolis Four. Justice is reflected in our policies on the ground and in our communities. And so as an organization, we really are looking at what needs to happen legislatively, both city, on every level of government, city, state, and national. We've seen the national office talk about this, our national president talk about this in recent days. Here locally, in the city of Boston, we are going to be advocating for a civilian review board with subpoena power. We are going to be advocating for increased funding in our schools and in our neighborhoods for restorative justice practices to be implemented systemically so that we can help to reduce the need for police in our communities and instead work in partnership with law enforcement to bring about greater peace. It's important for us also to keep in mind that what we saw in Minneapolis and what we're seeing in Minneapolis and what we saw in Georgia are examples of why leadership matters. We've seen in both of those instances, district attorney after district attorney that chose not to bring charges fully or have taken their time in bringing charges. That really speaks to a systemic issue. And so we need to also make sure that as we're looking at policies like the use of excessive force, we need to be looking at those policies again to help ensure that we are eliminating from those policies practices that really are not meant to keep the peace, but are meant to bring about death of individuals who are subjected to them. So when we look at a knee in the neck that leads to the murder of George Floyd, and there are questions swirling about whether or not it is justifiable, or whether or not these police officers can be held accountable, that speaks to a broken system. Because none of us who believe in humanity, none of us who believe in justice can believe for a moment that that is the type of death that someone should have to endure. So we really are looking at this from a legislative standpoint and from a policy standpoint. We are looking to work in partnership, hopefully, with law enforcement and to work in partnership with members of the bar to bring about the change that we really desperately, in the legislature, my apologies, that the change that we so desperately need to see here in the Commonwealth, here in the city of Boston, so that we can help to prevent the type of murder that we saw in Minneapolis and in Louisville, Kentucky, and in Georgia.
I saw that you tweeted that you witnessed de-escalation tactics last night between police and crowds, and that you seem to be pretty pleased with how things went. Another protest is planned for tomorrow. So what's your message to the people who are planning to participate in that?
Yeah, I do want to acknowledge that there were several conversations prior to the start of the protests yesterday with the city of Boston and the Boston Police Department and others about what the presence of our law enforcement officers would look like during these protests, understanding that we want these protests to be safe. And we want to make sure that everybody makes it home at night. Understanding that the presence of police officers, of law enforcement in this moment can be triggering for many people, and understandably so. So we greatly appreciate having the opportunity to work with our law enforcement officers yesterday to help ensure that the presence of law enforcement was not a presence that was overbearing throughout the protest. And so we were certainly pleased to see how the commissioner chose to deploy, particularly in the early stages of the protest. We also cannot ignore the fact that so many of us saw running on live television, some of the really abuse that was experienced by some of our officers. And so we do appreciate the de-escalation that we saw. We do appreciate the restraint that we saw. We also understand that there were some incidents last night where there are questions about how some officers may have interacted with protesters. So we will be looking at that. But net, we do appreciate that the BPD was responsive to our concerns and made whatever decisions they made with our concerns in mind.
Tanisha Sullivan, president of the Boston branch of the NAACP. Thank you for joining us and for your insight this morning.
Thank you.